this coffee shop talk that I've got prepared here really is an extension of a conversation that we've had really for a number of years with lots of different people on the two main themes that always come up in terms of organic farming systems is fertility and weed control, and that's what's on the title slide, which is slide 1 here. And I did give a couple of webinars for Northern Alberta last week on these two subjects. So I still have the old title on here, but I have changed this. In this presentation, I want to focus on soil fertility management. And so let's get going. So I'm going to tell you when I'm going to advance the slide. So advance the slide, please. This is a farming system model that Catherine Stanley put together for us. And I think it is really so important to be aware of the major factors in any farming system. And one that we've often talked about that's not on here is time management. And time is a very important resource. So let's go to the next slide. And here's something that I talk about with my diploma and degree students in the organic crop production course that I teach at Manitoba. And that is actually to think about what to do on the land before you transition. And the two things that I tell the students, and I'm telling all of us here today, is that feel that we want to transition to organic. In an ideal situation, we should deal with the perennial weeds using conventional methods, and we should fill up the soil nutrient fuel tank with all elements except nitrogen. If we put a ton of nitrogen on there, that's really just going to cause us weed problems, and we can fix our nitrogen. But I think when you're talking to your farmer clients, pre-transition strategies are important. Let's go to the next slide. So what about when we're in the rotation? Okay, so now we're through the transition. We're into the organic farming system. Next slide. Let's first just briefly touch on getting nitrogen into the system. This is something that we are often surprised at how difficult a time some farmers are having in achieving sufficient nitrogen status on their soil, be it lack of inoculation of their lentils, or of their legumes, I should say. Sorry, it's Monday morning. Okay, and it could be that they've used pre-inoculated seed that has just been stored too long, so there's no inoculation happening, and there may be other challenges. But very briefly, the whole concept of getting nitrogen into the system is through the use of legumes, which are the green plants on this slide, and then that nitrogen slowly decomposes through many different steps so that it's available to a non-legume crop. Managing that decomposition rate is something that farmers can do with tillage, with grazing. It's also affected by the environment, the moisture, and the temperature. We need to know that decomposition, that nitrogen mineralization period, is something that we have a little bit of control over. And that's something that I'm sure all of you are thinking about as you think about legumes in rotation. Let's go to the next slide. We're talking here about the long term, and so I wanted to share some of the results from the first legume in organic system data that I ever ran across in my career. These are the plots that used to be at the University of Manitoba, and if you go to the next slide, you see the results. And I think I want to spend a few minutes describing and learning from this 20-year data set. So let me explain what the graph means. Up on the top right-hand side, you'll see the rotation. It's a fallow wheat, corn, wheat rotation, and the arrow points to the wheat, and that means that the yields that we're looking at here on the table are from that last crop in the rotation. So it's 3 years after fallow or 3 years after green manuring. So the fallow was managed differently in different systems. It had the check at the bottom of that list on the right. The check is where they just fallowed that land.
Sorry, Martin, I'm just going to interrupt. Martin, I just want to interrupt quick. I just want to send a couple reminders to people on the call. If you could please mute your line, *6 to mute, or the microphone with a line through it. We can just hear a bit of feedback and a couple sneezes. Thanks.
Catherine, can you hear me? Am I on mute?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so I'll try mute. My mute button doesn't show me when I'm on.
Go ahead, Martin. Sorry.
And gesundheit to whoever sneezed. I hope your cold will end soon. So yeah, the fallow year was handled differently. It was either just black fallow, the check. The weeds were allowed to grow. It was planted either to sweet clover or pea green manure, or it was fallowed, but they also added farmyard manure. And so the years are on the bottom, and this experiment ran from the early 1920s until 1964, I believe, but this data just shows a 20-year period. And on the left hand, we have the difference in yield in bushels per acre. So the blue line at the 0, that's the checked line. And so the yield average there is 32 bushels per acre. So, what can we learn from this long-term data? Well, one thing that we can get out of the way very quickly is growing weeds as cover crops really did not lend any yield benefit to this system. In fact, it reduced the wheat yield. The other thing that we've learned is that the use of green manures or farmyard manure didn't appear to be super important in the first 5 years of the system, maybe even a bit longer, but then over time, that effect became a lot more powerful. And that's really one of the messages that I think you as agronomists working with organic farmers really need to think about. The rotations that we plan with green manures, they are really important for the long term sustainability of the system. And so by 20 years into the system, the wheat 3 years after the fallow or the green manure year was yielding up to 8 bushels higher than the check. And that's if you can just calculate based on today's organic prices, that's a significant increase. The other thing that we've learned here is that the sweet clover was providing some more benefits than peas, which is interesting. I'm really not surprised at that. And we also learned that the farmyard manure was also resulting in some really good outcomes. And I unfortunately don't have the rates of that manure. So that is something that may raise some questions in your mind, but I think you can come back to it and think about that, and maybe show it to your clients as well as a way of incentive to think for the long term. Now, these are very rich soils, and I think on lower organic matter soils, this effect would even be more powerful, and it would show up earlier. Okay, let's go to the next slide. I'm just going to go through these next slides fairly quickly, just to remind us that there are a lot of green manure legume species around that we can grow. Here are just some pictures of intercrops. I often get asked about, looking on the right-hand side there, about growing red clover instead of sweet clover, and the answer that I tell myself is that, well, red clover has got some advantages because it's more flooding tolerant, it's more shade tolerant, it's less competitive against the crop if it's underseeded, but sweet clover is a better nitrogen fixer, it's more drought tolerant, and but it's not as flooding tolerant, and it is more competitive with the crop if undersown. Going to the next slide, please. This is just a table that you can come back to, which describes some of the adaptation of different green manures. So pick the right one for the right scenario. Let's go to the next slide. This is just showing us that the green manure tool that is available through the Pivot and Grow website is very helpful, especially for novice organic farmers. Next slide, please. So here's a question that we've wrestled with quite a bit. Do I have to devote a whole year to a green manure? I won't make money that year. Do I have other options? And if you go to the next slide, here Joanne has put this slide together. It simply illustrates that there are very creative ways of designing that green manure year into a one-year grazing system. And that allows then the farmer to capture some economic value. We've been talking an awful lot about this here because of farmers' reluctance to grow legume manure in rotation, and when we can make an income from the green manure through grazing, it just creates a greater incentive. It does take an investment of infrastructure, perhaps an investment of linking up with neighbors who have animals, but it can make a significant economic positive impact. Let's go to the next slide. The next slide just shows something from our experience on the frequency of green manures in the rotation. The middle picture there is flax in a green manure rotation where we have the green manure 1 year and 4. On the right, we've got organic wheat at Carmen where we have our green manure 1 year and 3, and it really makes a difference. There are some ways of getting around this, and we'll talk about those in a moment, but designing the rotation to have a full green manure once every 3 years has significant benefits. And there are organic farmers who actually grow a green manure every other year just to try to grow a very high-yielding, profitable cash crop in the alternating years. And that might be a strategy you want to employ on a field that's a bit of a problem field, or one that also has some weed problems or fertility challenges early on in its life as an organic field. Next slide, please. I know a lot of you might be using the nutrient budgeting tool that we've created, but I wanted to just run through a very simple scenario of how to think about nitrogen in the rotation. So let's go to the next slide. I've made some assumptions there. You can read those on your own, but here's a very simple budget sheet that some of you may have seen me present previously. But basically, if on the left we have our crops, so we start with our green manure. Let's say we've got 3,600 pounds per acre of dry matter of green manure. 2.5% of that we typically think is fixed nitrogen out of the nodules. That gives us 90 pounds of nitrogen. Usually about 80% of that is available in the first 2 years. And so we can construct this very rough hypothetical budget. So if we grow 30 bushels of wheat, 14 bushels of flax, and then 50 bushels of oats, there we've grown 3 crops after the green manure. And I also allocate some nitrogen to the organic matter because bacteria are very in the organic pool are very efficient at consuming nitrogen. So basically, the long and the short of it is this type of rotation leaves us in a nitrogen deficit situation. So if you go to the next slide, this just shows that some grain legumes can add nitrogen even if we harvest them as grain. And you can go back to this table at your own time, but field pea, and I should add to this faba bean and lentil, they will all fix about 10 to 15 pounds per acre of nitrogen for every 1,000 pounds per acre of seed that's harvested. Okay, so you can come back to this and look at this figure, but if you go to the next slide, we're once again looking at a budget, and here we've inserted a pea crop instead of the flax, and you can see that's really improved the nitrogen balance of the system. This is a pea grain crop, not a pea green manure. So this is something that I think most of us think about intuitively, but when you're working with your clients, it's sometimes, you can use the Excel tool, but sometimes it's good just to do this kind of back of the envelope calculation to get people sort of to illustrate what's happening. So that's enough about nitrogen. I want to turn to mostly phosphorus. And, we talk about phosphorus a lot in organic farming. And when you put it on a budget sheet like this, when you calculate how much phosphorus has been extracted in those crops, it sometimes looks pretty frightening. And the same thing for other nutrients. But there's a couple of things that I want to say here that I think are quite well supported by prairie research, not just organic research, but other soils research like the long-term plots at Indian Head, the long-term plots at Lethbridge. And that is that if you have a reasonable level of phosphorus to begin with, and your soil is, it may be different if you're farming on very sandy soils, but if you've got soils that are, got some organic matter, you should be able to farm organically for 10 or 15 years before you ever have to think about phosphorus. And so, my message to farmers is, start off with a reasonable phosphorus load, and we're not talking 40 ppms here, even 15 parts per million. The research has shown that you're not going to have any phosphorus challenges, maybe for 20 years. And I like when farmers start out with a more positive phosphorus situation, because then they can keep it simple for the first 10 to 12 to 15 years of organic grain farming, and focus on the important things, which is nitrogen, weed control, and good agronomic management, like using high seeding rates, perhaps using that type of thing, and not to be swayed into buying products that they really don't need and that are unproven. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, though. This is a slide that has been shown quite a bit. Joanne Thiessen-Martens has put a number of presentations together to ask, how do I know if I have enough soil P? Okay, so next slide. And I'm not going to talk about this here, but I'm just going to alert you to the fact that we have two ways of determining phosphorus. One is the soil test. The other is the plant tissue test, which I think you've all heard quite a bit about. And there's lots of information about how to do that now. Next slide, please. So like I said, now here, this slide shows a horror story. This is long-term organic plots at Glenlee. This is not a grain rotation. This is a rotation where we harvest high yields of alfalfa off the system. And in this system, we did mine out the phosphorus pretty effectively after about 15 years, 20 years. It took a while. These are 5 to 6% organic matter soils in the Red River Valley. They're fertile soils, not the best soils in the prairies. There's more fertile soils in around Melfort and Edmonton area. But I just want to reiterate that in the grain farming rotation in this same study at Glenlee, we have not yet run into a phosphorus deficiency after a quarter century. But when we are in a situation where we do have a significant phosphorus shortage, we do need to intervene with something. And so that's what I want to talk about for the last few minutes of this webinar. And so what Joanne has done is taken our nutrient management calculator and applied it to 4 years at the Glenlee rotation on the plots that you're looking at. And I'll just explain the picture so that we understand it. In front of us is a plot of alfalfa, and the alfalfa has been seeded the entire length, the entire 30 meters of this plot. And no, we didn't use a herbicide in the back half of the plot. This is where we have never added any manure. And you can see the effect is quite dramatic. The manure is critical to that alfalfa growing well. The consequence of that, if you look at the plot on the right, there we have wheat growing, and in this case, because our plots have randomization in them, the back half of the plot is grown on the alfalfa that had the manure, and the front half, which you can only see a little corner of, is the wheat grown where we don't have any manure. And you can really see how that manure, that phosphorus deficiency in the alfalfa what it does is it reduces the nitrogen fixation in the alfalfa, and that really hurts the nitrogen requiring crops like wheat grown after alfalfa. Okay, so let's get to the budget. Let's go to the next slide. And this just shows some of the yields, and you can see the hay yield on the right there. This is just a reflection of the picture that you just saw. And you can see the wheat is benefiting from the compost. I'll talk about the flax a bit later. But you can come back to this, and this is just a quantification of the picture. So let's go to the next slide. And so what Joanne has done here is basically taken our 4-year rotation and put it through the nutrient calculator that we've developed. So on the left is the rotation. So we've got 2 years of alfalfa, then we've got wheat, then we've got flax, and then it goes back to alfalfa. And I think this is probably around year 22 to 26 or year 21 to 25. I forget exactly. But basically what we see on the left is it's looking at the phosphorus, okay? Just look at that phosphorus column. It's in pounds per acre. And we can see that we're extracting a lot of phosphorus. So over the 4 years, we've taken out 22 pounds per acre of phosphorus. Now what we've done is we split those plots, as you saw in the picture, and on the right-hand side, we've got manure. This is the manure side. And you can see here, we've actually fixed that problem quite nicely. We've added phosphorus to that first-year alfalfa, and so we right now have a 2.8 pound per acre surplus of phosphorus in that rotation. So we've fixed the problem. Now we haven't quite zeroed out the potassium challenge, and we haven't zeroed out the sulfur challenge because our manure wasn't as rich in those elements as perhaps it needed to be. And we need to think about that. Potassium, of course, in the long term is a challenge on sandy soils, on clayey, loamy, silty soils. It's much less of a problem, but we should be monitoring it through the green manure tool, and the same with sulfur. And there are elemental forms of those that can be added in organic systems. So, how have we done? Well, phosphorus problem is solved. But then if we look over at the nitrogen column in the manure section, we go like, whoa, we're really building up our nitrogen. We're building up our nitrogen quite significantly in that system, and that is not good. That's gonna leach. That's going to be perhaps it means that we spent too much money on manure. What can we do about that? So what Joanne did then is she ran a couple of scenarios, and let's go to the next slide. And how to improve the glenulate rotation. So option 1 is to increase the wheat yields. Let's extract some of that nitrogen out by actually improving our yields through things like better tillage, more timely tillage, higher seeding rates, all the things that increase yield. So she budgeted. So let's say we increase our wheat yield from 36 to 45 bushels. We're extracting more nitrogen if we increase the flax yield, but we still have a significant nitrogen surplus. Our phosphorus is still pretty good. It's pretty well at 0. Okay, what's another option here? Let's go to the next slide. Option 2, how about adding another crop to the rotation? Because alfalfa is not just a 1-year green manure. It is adding more nitrogen to the system. And when we add an oat crop to that rotation, we are extracting quite a bit more of that nitrogen. We're also tapping into the phosphorus a bit more. So that's another option. And I just want to pause and clarify. You might be thinking at this point, Martin is contradicting himself. It truly is Monday morning. His brain is scattered because he told us earlier that you need a green manure every 3 years and not every 4 years, and now you're showing us data where you've basically got 3 grain crops. The difference between a 1-year green manure and alfalfa is that alfalfa adds, a multi-year alfalfa stand tends to add more nitrogen to the system. Okay, let's go to option 3, because Joanne had another option for us, and I think this one made a lot of sense, and that is actually to reduce the rate of the manure that we applied, because we're applying high rates of manure. And so that brought the nitrogen surplus down quite a bit. That is probably a sensible thing to be doing. So, these are just examples of how we deal with this, but we can't lose sight of the original objective of the work at Glenlee with the manure, and that is to solve the phosphorus deficiency, which we did very nicely. But what we learned is our manure rates were a bit high, and so we were creating a nitrogen surplus, which is also probably the reason why we now have more wild oats in those plots. And we need to rethink our nitrogen our manure rates. We need to think about extending the rotation. We need to think about growing higher yields through better weed management. So I think these are conversations, that you can have with your clients as you're talking about long-term management of systems. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This is what Joanne has been telling people, that with phosphorus, we do have to replace periodically. In a grain farming system on a clayey, silty soil where you're starting off with reasonable phosphorus, you probably don't even need to have this conversation for the first 15 years of the organic system. Keep on top of it with the nutrient management, with the green manure tool. Figure out what your phosphorus and sulfur and potassium and micros are at with that tool. But your clients should not be scouring the trade shows for a quick fix on nutrients for the first 10 years if they started off in a reasonable position. But once you are in a place where you need to be replacing, you can look at sources. I'm going to give you talk about that price list, which you've probably gone ahead and seen. If you're using manure sources, you have to be patient. It's not always quick, although some of our recent work is showing that if soils are really deficient, they respond to manure very quickly. Next slide, please. These are just some of the sources of phosphorus that are available, and in terms of application rates, there's some suggestions there in terms of the application. Sure. And I want to go to the next slide, and this is quite an exciting slide for me. What Joanne did was to scour the last year. This is the last year's prices. She scoured the industry to see what phosphorus products were available and how much do they cost per pound of P2O5 or per pound or per ton. And so you can take a look at this list on your own, and in the next slide it shows where you can access some of these products. And then at the bottom she's got monoammonium phosphate fertilizer and sort of the usual stuff, and from one particular supplier. And then in the middle there she's got a bunch of manure case studies, which these are real life situations. So for example, at the bottom of the manure row, it says manure solid poultry source number 2, and this includes transport and application, and the transport was from 90 miles away, and it cost that farmer $3.64 per pound of the right-hand column, $1.52 per pound of total P2O5. That is cheaper than every one of those products above. It is more expensive than monoammonium phosphate and liquid phosphate, but of course we can't use those in organic production. This is something that I would really challenge agronomists to do with their farmer clients when there is a nutrient shortage, to say, no, let's really look at where are phosphorus sources, where is manure available, get it tested, and then do an economic analysis. How much is it really going to cost us per pound of total P2O5? One thing I should clarify is in the standardized cost columns, the middle column is the easily available P2O5, but it's okay to use the column on the right because all of the P2O5 out of the manure or the phosphorus out of the manure will eventually be available. So, yes, and there may be some questions about that. And let me just ask you to go to the next slide then. Sorry, go 2 slides ahead, and then I'll come back to that one picture. This is the last slide of the PDF file, and this shows the places where you can get access to these fertilizers that you can use in organic. But of course, we don't have a market for manure that's as easily accessible as these. So manure sources, farmers, have to go and scour themselves. But maybe you as crop advisors might want to provide that service to farmers. Find out, hire a summer student, find out who's got manure, where it is, who's willing to sell it, who's willing to give it away, who's got a backhaul that can bring, all those things. Okay, let's go back one slide. I just wanted to show you one very interesting picture, and this is again at our Glenley long-term plots, and while alfalfa does not grow well with low phosphorus, and wheat needs the nitrogen, this is just an interesting observation. What we've been noticing with the flax, which we grow after wheat in that rotation, is that it actually does reasonably well where we have extremely low rates of phosphorus. And this slide here kind of gives us a clue as to why the flax is doing well. The back half of the plot is a non-compost plot, so that's where we don't add any manure. We use the word compost and manure interchangeably, I'm sorry, but it's composted manure that we're using. And the back half, the flax is growing pretty well, but there's no wild mustard because, well, wild mustard is not mycorrhizal. It cannot get the phosphorus out of the organic matter like the flax can. Whereas in the front of the plot, the flax does actually always look a little bit better, especially in the last few years, because we are very low phosphorus levels here. But we see the non-mycorrhizal weeds competing, and so we spend a lot of time standing, as you can see by our shadow, though we spend a lot of time standing next to this plot, really pondering, what does this mean for a farmer? What does this mean for advising farmers? And if you take a look closely into that canopy of flax, you can see that there's not just wild mustard. There's also wild oats. And this is a clear indication to me, knowing these plots quite well, that we've got too much nitrogen in there. We never used to have wild oats in this system, and it's really a consequence of us having used too much manure, which and maybe what we should do is use poultry manure instead of beef cattle manure, so we'll have a higher proportion of or use a manure source that's high in phosphorus and low in nitrogen. Or maybe we want to consider a very low rate of manure and some of these other products that we could blend into the manure. So I'm sure your creative minds will come up with other solutions. So that's where I'm going to end the webinar today, and I'll send it back to Catherine to host the rest of the coffee shop, and perhaps there's some discussion that this might have generated.
Great, thanks, Martin. Very timely topic, as I'm sure the producers and agronomists on the call are thinking about their nutrient management strategies for the year. So at this point, if anybody has some questions or a comment related to the call, please feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, it's Ian Cushion. I have a question for Martin. At what level of soil phosphorus in soil test results should we be very concerned about inhibiting nitrogen fixation and light use?
Yeah. I can't give you a good answer because I don't know. I have not done any research on that, and well, I shouldn't say I haven't done any research. I'm looking at our system at Glenlee. I guess we have done research there, and where our alfalfa is growing in the back half of the plot with the very, very low phosphorus, that phosphorus is at about 3 parts per million. I've run into one other situation where the plot where another farm where land is at 3 parts per million, and Harry Vetch, for example, has nodulated just fine. And I know Joanne was reflecting on a story where one organic farmer in Manitoba was, I think, struggling. I think the story goes he was struggling with nitrogen fixation, but when he grew Harry Vetch on very, very low phosphorus soil, it nodulated better than other legumes that he was growing. So it may depend on the legume species. There may be other nutrient factors involved, but that's a very good question, and I think the final comment I would make is that this is one of the benefits of going with that nutrient, the green manure tool, where we actually use the plant to sense the phosphorus availability in the soil, and we're using legume plants, and we can check for their nodulation and make a connection to see how the phosphorus uptake in the plant relates to the nodulation. It's a good question. I'm going to dig out some literature, and I will get Catherine to, I will ask our host to send that out to all the participants, and so we can give you a better answer than this.
This is Joanne here too. I was just kind of listening in, and would just add that in looking at farms, mostly in Manitoba and a few in Saskatchewan, the last couple of years, that below 5 parts per million is where we tend to see more problems. Above 5, most green manure crops seem to be doing okay, but it varies. Above about 8 or 9, then it seems to be the green manure crops seem to do well fairly consistently. So it's in that 4 to 8 range where it's hard to tell how they're going to respond. And yeah, like Martin said, the species will vary, and other soil factors will probably come into play there.
Thanks, Joanne. And I think what we'll do is we'll work together here to put together a little informal fact sheet, and we'll send it out.
Yeah, I would. That information about Harry Vetch being able to nodulate at 3 parts per million, if there's a way of coming up with sort of, I mean, it could be highly variable depending on location, soil types, all those things. But if we do know that Harry Vetch is an option, a better option than sweet clover, for example, or alfalfa at low phosphorus levels, then that would be very helpful for me anyway, in terms of trying to figure out what to do next on these long-term organic fields that are really low in phosphorus.
While we're on that subject, one of the things that we are planning to do here is to create a kit for agronomists and farmers, where we'll send out a number of different phosphorus sources and some different legume seed species with the appropriate inoculant, and allow people to do their own bioassay. So go collect soil off their fields, put them in pots or some kind of container on their windowsill, and then spike them with different amendments using different legume species. And I think because this could be quite site-specific, it would be something that agronomists could work with farmers to do a bioassay on this using the farmer's actual soil. So that's something that we have mentioned to a few farmers, a couple of weeks ago, but we are planning to extend that service to agronomists or farmers who wish to participate. So you'll be hearing more about that very, very shortly.
Great, thanks for the question, Ian. If anybody else has questions, feel free to go now. For those of you who I may be trapped in the mute world, it's *6 or *7 to unmute yourself.
I've got one here, Scott Beaton from just west of Winnipeg. Martin, in a higher pH soil, I think we were always taught that phosphorus was tied up in a conventional system. Do you feel as though plants are likely more able to extract phosphorus from those soils than we would otherwise see? And so I guess it's kind of similar to Ian's question in that, is there a different level that one should be concerned about in that situation, or do you have any thoughts?
Well, great question. One of the fortunate things about the Glenlee plots is they are in a high pH. They are in a relatively high pH soil system, and they're calcareous, so they're classic soils for locking up and making phosphorus, binding phosphorus in the calcium complex. I was surprised after 10 years of Glenlee. We had some other rotations in there for a while. We had one with sweet clover every 4 years, and after 10 years, or perhaps it was after 12 years, we did soil testing on all those plots, and the organic plot that had the sweet clover green manure actually had its phosphorus levels had gone up. And, I was really puzzled. I thought, well, I'm not trained as a soil scientist. I'm a cropping systems agronomist. I talked to people, and they said, well, that's probably you're just building your organic matter pool. And you're drawing that phosphorus out of the organic matter pool and recycling it. And then I went to the literature, and the exact same thing had happened at Indian Head in the long-term plots. The sweet clover containing rotations had made phosphorus out of the organic matter available and brought it into the system. Of course, there's a limit, and at Indian Head, that rotation of sweet clover wheat, which was started in 1958, it started running out of phosphorus close to about 20 years, and then the wheat yield started going down. So that's not really answering your question. That's just mumbling along like a middle-aged man. But it gives some background, but I think it also points to the fact that there's a lot of phosphorus in the organic matter. And I remember taking soil fertility from John Stewart at the University of Saskatchewan, and he was very interested in organic phosphorus, which at the time I knew nothing about. And a lot of the phosphorus in the prairie soils are in the organic phase, and we have done quite a bit of work on that at Glenlee, and we've noticed that these organic systems have higher levels, significantly higher levels of organic phosphorus than the conventional systems. And so I think there is something to what you're saying, and I think we have evidence to support that. But we are at that tipping point. I think we want to back off from the tipping point of, as Joanne said, less than 6 parts per million or whatever of phosphorus, and try to be closer to 10 than 0. And then I think a lot of the a carbon-rich cropping system can function really well. And I'll make one final comment, and that is I had the opportunity to work with Roland Bunch and Alden in the tropics, and Roland has done most of his work in Latin America, and on the tropical soils, it's always thought that, well, if you're going to have a phosphorus deficiency really early, and you're going to always have to add phosphorus, otherwise nothing grows. And what he noticed is when systems that had a lot of legume cover crops in them, they never really responded to phosphorus. And this is after decades. So managing phosphorus out of the organic matter is something we're learning to do, I believe, but we cannot be reckless, and we have to respect some of our soil and tissue levels. Hopefully that helps.
Yep, good, thank you.
Are there any more questions from the group for Martin? Ooh.
Yeah,
Hello.
Ian Grosser calling. Hello? Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it's Ian Grosser. Just a comment on that study from the kind of 1930 to 50. I remember I had Al Ridley as a soils prof way back then, but when I was looking at the data there, it almost explains the BU research that we've been doing here for the last 5 years following our organic system through transition, and there hasn't been any real yield boost to varying rates of compost, but that maybe kind of, that data there kind of explains what's going on, and it's going to take a few more years maybe. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. It's just that Christmas present was just wrapped with many layers of wrapping paper.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, every year, that is a classic response. Jeff Shano at the University of Saskatchewan has documented, you know, it takes, 6 to 8 years sometimes to get the get the manure functioning. And Don Flayton at our plots, he's got some really interesting manure plots at the U of M at the Glenlee station, and some of those manure plots did nothing for the first 5 years. And in fact, they even immobilized a little bit of nutrients. So, but I think in most cases, the news is good. You will get the benefits out of that.
Got a question about composted manure. Am I on?
Yep, you're on.
You're on.
Okay, good. Having a bit of technical problems here. Back to that Glenlee rotation where you're running into excess nitrogen buildup over a period of time. Would using composted manure and then extending that your nitrogen using crop rotation, would that alleviate some of that problem, or would it not make any difference?
I think it would. I think it would make a big difference, and I mean, we were using composted manure, but perhaps it started off just too rich in nitrogen, and I think what you're referring to, if I catch this correctly, that the composting process will cause the manure to lose nitrogen, right?
Right. Yeah.
So you concentrate the phosphorus in a smaller, with less nitrogen, and so I think your logic is right on, and I think there are manure management specialists like Catherine Buckley at Ag Canada Brandon. That's why I put her name on there. You may want to contact her and ask her how to achieve that, but that would be a good strategy. One other strategy I think that would be really nice is that if we could spike the manure with phosphorus, with an acceptable phosphorus source that was affordable, and there's some interest now in these struvite products where the phosphorus is extracted out of sewage sludge. I think the people who are thinking about that are really thinking wisely into the future, because we've got all this phosphorus concentrated in cities. Don Flayton calls cities the largest feedlots in the country, and he's right. And so, but that nitrogen phosphorus balance in the manure is something that we need to work at. The other person that you may want to contact is Jerry Dubé with he's near Steinbeck. He's with Overton Environmental. He's a very good compost maker, and he's bringing really novel phosphorus sources like shells from the fisheries into the thing, and he's actually adding stuff to compost for different reasons, but I think you're on a very good track there.
Okay.
We have time for one or two more questions from the group if anybody else has something they'd like to add or comment.
Yeah, Brian Simonson here. Just going back to Ian's comment, I'm not sure if I understood what you were talking about, Martin. Would it be maybe a biology problem?
That is. I'm gonna. I kind of feel like throwing that one out to Joanne, who I know is on the call, but that's putting her on the spot. I think if you're referring to, what is the challenge with nitrogen fixation at extremely low available phosphorus rates, that's a good point you make. I mean, I don't think we can rule biology out. And what I hear Bobby Helgeson talking about and studying, Bobby Helgeson is a soil microbiologist at Ag Canada, Saskatchewan. She works on the long-term organic plots at Scott, and she has actually documented that some of the poorly functioning organic systems in that area are short of carbon, of all things. And so that is quite interesting. And so it's not like that the organisms are not in the soil, because I think my reading of the literature is that the exact makeup of organisms in the soil often isn't the missing link, but the food source for them, or giving them a happy environment and a food source, can be a limiting factor. So that doesn't really answer your question, Brea, but I think it is involved. I think the biology of the system. One final comment on that, though, is that if you had to invest in something to make that system more productive, what should you invest in? I mean, I would invest in. I think the literature suggests that you should invest in two things: carbon and phosphorus. And carbon you can grow, and phosphorus, at some point you need to import. Great question.
Yeah, thanks.
Ian here. I got results from Quorum Labs via Michael Dealey, and they did report on total organic carbon and inorganic carbon, and then give a total carbon result. I'm just wondering what levels of carbon are indicators of healthy soil.
I'm just going to say real quickly, that is a question for Bobby Helgeson.
Okay.
And I'm just going to waste your time by trying to. I will say that inorganic carbon is actually something that's probably not nearly as important as organic carbon. But Bobby is speaking in Saskatoon, I think, next week, and maybe our host can get Bobby onto the call at some point to talk about that exact issue.
Yeah, we will. Bobby will be on a call later in April or early in May. We're just nailing down a day. So you can all ask her that question then.
Okay, thanks.
So I think we have time for one more question if there's any from the group.
Yeah, it's Arlen from Saskatchewan here. I missed the first half, so hopefully you didn't, this wasn't already covered, but I was reading some old provincial fact sheet, and it was talking about kind of spiking manure with rock phosphate and elemental sulfur to kind of acidify the phosphate and make it more plant available. I was wondering if you have any information or comments on that.
I think it makes perfectly good sense. Theoretically, it makes sense. And my only advice is, I actually talked about that with the diploma students here, and I said, if you do it when you're young, because it's kind of like the manure story that we heard about. It's going to take some time, but it's going to become available over time. So I think it requires some more research and under different sort of compost management systems, and also, and people like Jerry Dubé, who's an expert compost maker. It'd be really nice to bring into that conversation. But do you remember, Arlen, who wrote that fact sheet?
it was a like government of Saskatchewan fact sheet on soil fertility.
Yeah. Well,
and it was quite vague. It just was like a small paragraph. So.
Yeah, and I think, Saskatchewan has had tremendous soil fertility strength, both at the university and federal government and provincial government over the years, because soil health has been an issue since the summer fallow days, And so I think that is, I don't know if there's data, and we will look to see if there's data on somebody having done that, so we can give you an idea of how available that will be. But I think it is something that is worth considering, depending on what the price of everything is. I think it is thank you for bringing it up.
Thanks.